Pastor Derek here, and I have another book review. This is called Grace Gone Wild by Robert Jeffress, an excellent pastor up in Texas. This is actually a book that one of my elders and trustees gave me to read, and I read it, and I real much enjoyed it. And I should say the subtitle is Getting a Grip on God's Amazing Gift, which is grace. And let me just read the back of the book just so you have an idea. It says, Grace has become a part of this basic vocabulary of every Christian. Unfortunately, many believers are abusing God's amazing gift of grace. They have perverted God's undeserving gift of forgiveness and making it a license for immorality, self-indulgence, and minimal involvement in God's kingdom. In the process, they are robbing themselves of the joy that comes from obedience to God. And in a provocative book, pastor, author, Dr. Robert Jeffress challenges you to gain a biblical understanding of grace and reveals how God's grace can protect your marriage, church, and relationship from the confusion and even abuse. To start exploring the true freedom of living obediently in God's grace, good grace, discover Grace Gone Wild. And just kind of give you an idea about Dr. Robert Jeffress, if you haven't heard of him. He is the senior pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. And we're not talking about a small church, it is a large church. A Fox News contributor, adjunct professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, and that's a top theological seminary. He is the host of Pathway to Victory, a radio and television program reaches more than 195 countries. Dr. Jeffress is also the author of more than 26 books, including Clutter-Free Christianity, When Forgiveness Doesn't Make Sense, and The Divine Defense. This is a great book. I really enjoyed reading it. And one of the things the book does is explain what is God's grace and how God's grace should be used. And he says that one people abuse God's grace because after receiving grace and forgiveness, they lead into what often is called legalism, which is a works-based faith. And that unless you do these good works, then you're not saved. And he says, well, that's a mistake. That you don't want to go that way. That's not a correct way to view it. However, on the flip side, he says other people use God's grace not into legalism or works righteousness. Other people use God's grace to lead into licentiousness, liberalism, and saying, who are you to judge? This is the way I think God's leading me. And only the gods can say which right and wrong with me. You cannot judge me. And so this book says we need to find the balance, and no, we don't want to go too far this way. We don't want to go too far this way. How should we view grace? How should we live out grace in our lives? And so this is what God's Grace Gone Wild is about. And so, kind of give an idea in some of the chapters. The first chapter is a great escape, the grace escape, and what is that? And that chapter really gives a good illustration of what we're talking about when grace goes wild. Well, it leads to saying and doing stuff that the Bible clearly says is wrong. You should not do these things, but they allow God's grace. They've used God's forgiveness and grace to do stuff that they should not do. Under new management, which is you need to understand that when you receive grace, when you receive forgiveness, that you are not now just free to do whatever you want, but you have a king, you have a Lord, you have a God, and your job is to serve him faithfully, not an obligation, and not out of legalism, not out of works, not out of proving yourself, but out of your love for God, as you would love your spouse, your wife, your kids, out of that great love that you now have new things you need to do. laying down the law without giving up grace. And so there's an aspect of the law of works right we need to get rid of, but at the same time without giving up grace, and we have to find this balance. The chapter 4, God's grace, spirituality, God's grace, decision making, and how do we do that? God grace in relationship, God grace in marriage, and God grace in divorce, God's grace in churches, God's grace giving, God's grace confrontation, God's grace spiritual surgery, and dancing on a tightrope. And that's really he's trying to say there is a pathway to go, and it is not into legalism and works righteousness, which is what I prefer to say, and then there's liberal and do whatever you want and whatever feels right, and that's the other ditch. In God's grace and through His mercy and forgiveness, through the sanctification of the Holy Spirit, there's this pathway that you should be walking down. You're going to slip into one side. Sometimes you have to pull yourself out, and you're going to slip to the right, and then pull yourself out. But we are always repenting and turning and moving and trying to get on this pathway. But if you ever go all the way too far into legalism, that's bad. And that's not good grace, that's bad grace. Equal is both a bad grace when it leads into the other ditch that leads you into liberalism and doing whatever you want. Who are you to judge? And so it's a real good book trying to find this balance between these two things. So I highly recommend Grace Gone Wild by Robert Jeffress. You can get the book on Amazon. Also, if you go to his website, he has a video series that you can do and workbooks you can do. And for a small donation, you can get the DVD, a book, some workbooks, and you can do it as a small group. You can do it as a church. But I really like this book and I highly recommend it. Again, Grace Gone Wild by Robert Jeffress. God bless and have a great day.